Like and subscribe in the next 5 seconds, or this will be in your bed tonight. Who is the bad guy in history who isn't actually a bad guy? That Roman that gave Jesus vinegar to drink. Turns out that the Roman military gave their soldiers a water/vinegar mix to drink as it was good for refilling salt levels after sweating. That means all the Roman did was give Jesus a sip of his own drink, not force him to drink vinegar as punishment insult. Basically gave a thirsty guy Gatorade. It's got electrolytius. Despite what was portrayed in Amadeus, and though in reality they were musical rivals, Antonio Salieri was actually friends with Wolfgang Mozart. In fact, years after Mozart's death, Salieri assisted with and helped finance his son Franz Xaver's musical education as a tribute to his late friend. Isn't the theory that he poisoned Mozart because he was jealous of his big dong? That's the myth that was portrayed in the movie Amadeus. Edit. In the movie, Salieri was responsible for the death of Mozart because he was jealous. He didn't use poison in the movie, and as others have pointed out, the myth that Salieri killed Mozart is older than the movie. A more modern example is the lady that famously sued McDonald's for their coffee being too hot in 1994. That lawsuit gets treated as an example of how oversaturated America is with litigation over small things. As it turns out, however, her situation was extremely justified. She suffered third-degree burns that required skin grafting and had permanent disfigurement. Her labia fused together. Needless to say, McDonald's was serving their coffee far too hot, and the case very well may have prevented future similar incidents. Edit. To the people saying it's her fault for spilling her coffee, here's a picture of her injuries. NSFW and NSFL. Does anybody really deserve those injuries for the simple mistake of spilling their coffee? Would you really expect third-degree burns if you spilled coffee on yourself? My tax law professor used this case as an example when I was still in undergrad. He first asked how many people think the amount she won in the suit was justified, and most said that it was total bullshit. He then asked one simple question. How much would it take for you to pour a cup of boiling water on your genitals? $1 million? $5 million? $10 million? Needless to say, almost no hands went up. She deserved every penny and more. I 1000% agree that she deserved every penny and that what happened to her was horrible. I also would probably do it for $5 million if I'm being honest. My dad apparently, because every time we talk it's always, buddy IDK, why you think I'm the bad guy? Feel like every male goes through some degree of this. 012 dad Superman. 1320 dad's a controlling dong. 2025 holy shit dad's just a human ducking everything up. 2550 how the duck did my dad ever keep everything together. 50 plus I wish I could be half the man my dad was and can't wait to see him again. I'm 22 and already wish to be half the man my dad is. Marie Antoinette. The woman was a spoiled rich girl, sure, but the whole damn country condemned her despite the fact her husband was and always had been the one in charge of things. She was also a little child at the time of the whole let them eat cake thing happened and not actually in charge of anything. It's also not even certain she ever actually said that, as the quote was attributed to her by a biographer several years later who are not even sure actually met her. If I recall correctly, it wasn't actually cake either. It was brioche, which is like a sweet bread. Edit. I decided to do some quick googling. Pretty much every article one saw said the following. She never said it as far as anyone knows. It looks like it was said by a Spanish princess or queen before Antoinette, and the comment was incorrectly attributed to her to help explain her poor public relations. It was a mistranslation as I thought. I was first told this by my high school French teacher, so I trusted her, but then I found this quote and many others like it. Well, for starters, the English translation of what was originally in French is confused. Marie Antoinette is said to have actually said Quils mangent de la brioche. This translates into English as let them eat brioche, a sweet French breakfast bread. 3. Brioche is a breakfast bread, sweeter, and slightly more expensive. Cakes were definite luxury items and not something anyone would think a peasant would be able to eat, so while the comment would still be insulting, it makes more sense that an aristocrat would say, "Huh, they're out of regular bread? What about the sweet breakfast bread? Yeah, they can eat that." Darius III and Xerxes. They're portrayed badly because of Alexander the Great and also the movie 300. Yeah, In reality, their kingdom was actually fairly progressive. When taking over lands, local leaders and religions were allowed to remain, however advisory members were sent in to help update settlements with better economic and civic organizations and so on. Really, they weren't that bad of a kingdom for that time period standards, and the reason they fought the Greeks was because classically Greek cities had tried to rebel with the support of Greek mainland city-states, which prompted war. History isn't so black and white as Hollywood wants it to be. Dan Carlin raises a really interesting point about the Achaemenid Persians being progressive for the time, as you say, because some of the regional powers that preceded them, such as the Assyrian Empire, were so brutal that they'd effectively subdued these places enough that they could get away with a soft touch approach here and there. Neville Chamberlain was widely hated in the UK after the Britain went to war with Germany because of his policy of appeasement towards the Nazi-run Germany when he was Prime Minister, even being one of the central people who allowed Germany to annex Czechoslovakia, which blew up in his face when the Germans invaded Poland and triggered the Second World War. He was forced to resign as Prime Minister less than a year into the war due to revolt from the Labour and Liberal parties and handed the reins over to Winston Churchill, who was himself forced out of office after the First War because of fears that Germany would rearm. However, due to British laws about disclosing classified documents 30 years after their being sealed, it emerged that Britain couldn't risk Germany's anger during the Czech debacle as they were thoroughly unprepared for war. Chamberlain delayed the inevitable, which gave the Allies a significant helping hand when the war finally did happen. My history teachers hated this misconception every time World War II came up. Dude had to do what he had to help his country. Worth a read. LegalagacyWordPress.com link. Whatever else history may or may not say about these terrible, tremendous years, we can be sure that Neville Chamberlain acted with perfect sincerity according to his lights and strove to the utmost of his capacity and authority, which were powerful, to save the world from the awful, devastating struggle in which we are now engaged. This alone will stand him in good stead as far as what is called the verdict of history is concerned. Edit. Learned about AMP links today. Thanks all. Anyone who won a war then rewrote history books, except Japan. They lost and still rewrote the history books for their own students. I'm curious, what were the things that they rewrote? Historically significant events like the Nanjing Rape and Massacre of 1937 and comfort women, sex slaves, during World War II. It came about from their efforts to whitewash their actions from, for example, World War II. From Wiki, there was a case in the 1960s where a description of the Nanjing Massacre and other war crimes committed by the Japanese military before and during World War II was rejected by the Ministry of Education. The author sued the ministry, finally winning the case decades later. Historian Stephen E. Ambrose noted that the Japanese presentation of the war to its children runs something like this. One day, for no reason we ever understood, the Americans started dropping atomic bombs on us. It's also interesting to read their justification for attacking Pearl Harbor. Edit. My first ever gold, so thanks for that. Edit. I've read lots of replies and gained fascinating insights into other countries that have also rewritten history by erasing, changing and censoring aspects of their past, so I don't mean to insinuate Japan was alone in doing this. Machiavelli would be shocked and saddened to know his name is synonymous with tyranny and pure evil. Guy was a staunch supporter of republics and a savvy politician. I kinda feel like we call something Machiavellian for the same reason we call something Orwellian. We aren't making him out to be a bad guy. There are people surprised that his statue is up in Florence and shocked to see they actually admire him. When you learn more about him, he's far more interesting than his historical reputation would have you believe. More so sports history, but the film Cinderella Man portrayed boxer Max Baer as a murderous psychopath who gladly killed two fighters in the ring. In reality, he was personally devastated by these deaths. In the one he was most directly responsible for, he ended up giving his winnings from his next few fights to the fighter's family. Watch this in history class, and my teacher brought us up as how movies and articles change facts for a better story. And he gave the world Jethro Bodine, perhaps the best double naught spy ever. Look, if Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure has taught me anything, Mr. the Kid is an awesome guy. Billy, you are dealing with the oddity of time travel with the greatest of ease. The Roman Emperor Gaius Caesar, better known as Caligula, hell of a smear campaign his enemies did, most likely brought upon himself because of his intolerance to the Senate's corruption and or lack of effectiveness. The crazy stories, most likely made up or were willful misrepresentation of something Caligula said. The story about him making his horse consul because he was crazy, misrepresentation of him mocking the Senate by telling them his horse could do a better job. I'm not sure whether this is true, but he declared himself a god and ordered the army to throw their spears into the water after a quarrel with Neptune. To be fair, just about every Roman emperor was declared a god after their death. Little Boots just jumped the gun a bit. Yes, that's what Caligula means. Not really a bad guy, but Reddit has a tendency to judge medieval early Renascimental famous people as pedophile because they married their wife after the first blood. But at the time the average age for a girl to menstruate was more 16-17, so they weren't ducking 12-year-old. Also, it was common among kings to marry legally to forge an alliance, but to not really live as a couple since many years after. So even if King X really did marry a 13 years old, there is a very good chance that for a good 5 years they didn't even use the same room. Also, a big part of a woman's role back then was to have children. Once they were old enough to do that, it was old enough to marry. Attempting to judge by modern standards is nearly like attempting to judge the social behaviors of gorillas by our standards. It's just a non-starter. It's as if these people don't think some Zoomers in 200 years will look back at them and judge them on modern morals as well. Can you believe they used to use fossil fuels? Idiots. Religion? Idiots. Holding their partners to a two-person relationship? How selfish. Democratic elections instead of using algorithms to find the best people? Idiots. Not so much history per se, but Pontius Pilate was definitely a real dude who gets a bad rap by a couple billion Christians. Even the Gospels recognize that he really didn't want to kill Jesus. But the Sanhedrin, ruling class of high priests in Judea, more or less forced his hand. What's more, Pilate allegedly looked for every out to not put him to death. First he refused to hear the case, then kicked it to the ruler of Galilee, Herod Antipas, then gave Jesus every opportunity to wiggle out of the charges. It was only after the insistence of the Sanhedrin, refusal of Antipas to hear the case, and Jesus' stubborn commitment, or even desire, to be crucified that he passed the sentence. The whole deal with Pilate washing his hands after condemning Jesus was basically a gesture to "I did everything I could to avoid this. It's on you." All in all, a pretty solid Roman politician trying to rule a Roman backwater and deal with an unruly quasi-insurgent group as best he could. He was given a more or less impossible task, and was essentially used by the Sanhedrin. But all most Christians remember is that Jesus Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate. Full disclaimer, I am not a Christian, and obviously the history here is poorly documented, if at all, and the specifics in the Bible are almost certainly inaccurate. But Pilate was a real dude who was the Roman governor of Judea at the time, and by all accounts did his job as well as could be expected. Christian here. In the Bible studies and sermons I've attended, Pilate is never painted as a bad guy. In fact, many commentaries and pastors point out, as you did, that he tried his best not to crucify Jesus. I had a Roman Catholic upbringing and we were definitely taught that Pilate did not want to crucify Jesus. Not painted as a bad guy in the slightest, rather a man reluctantly fulfilling his duty. Richard III. He's just such a nice guy. That was amazing. Thank you. I was definitely a victim of Tudor propaganda till that video. Horrible Histories is simply excellent. I definitely recommend watching more. At least S1-5R. They replaced most of the cast S6 onwards and I hear it's not that good. Spain got blamed for the 1918 pandemic because they were the only country honestly reporting on it. Other countries did not want to look weak during World War I and wouldn't report on it. Turned out that a farm in Kansas and possibly the French trenches were the actual origin. Edit. Chinese laborers locked in boxcars in Canada seems to be the current leading theory. NationalGeographic.com link. In the new report, Humphreys finds archival evidence that a respiratory illness that struck northern China in November 1917 was identified a year later by Chinese health officials as identical to the Spanish flu. He also found medical records indicating that more than 3,000 of the 25,000 Chinese Labor Corps workers who were transported across Canada en route to Europe starting in 1917 ended up in medical quarantine, many with flu-like symptoms. Vlad the Impaler. The funniest story is how he once disguised as one of his enemies and infiltrated into their army, and when they were all drunk he attacked them and no one knew who was the imposter, so they all fought with people from their own army instead of the actual infiltrator. IDK read kinda sus tbh. Also, second nomination, Warren G. Harding. His administration was very corrupt. He was pretty immoral, and there were some policy mishaps, all of which have put him on many lists of worst presidents ever. But his administration also reversed many of the authoritarian policies of President Wilson. He liberalized the economy. Wilson had imposed many controls during the war, allowing recovery and a boom to emerge from a major recession. He issued pardons for political prisoners like Eugene V. Debs, who had been jailed for protesting World War I, while Wilson, a notorious racist, had moved towards segregating the civil service. Harding moved back towards integration and tried to hire more African Americans. He lobbied for a federal anti-lynching bill to let agencies like the FBI go after the Klan. He also arranged a formal peace treaty with Germany, since the Senate wouldn't ratify Versailles, but Wilson wouldn't propose anything but Versailles. His rather humble philosophy on the role and character of the presidency is also refreshing when compared to the messianism that infects the office today as it had under Wilson. Despite the scandals that rocked his presidency, he was incredibly popular at the time, and for good reason. He was very easy to mock though because he was so incoherent. One of my favorite quotes is about Harding's rhetorical style. An army of pompous phrases moving over the landscape in search of an idea. Sometimes these meandering words actually capture a straggling thought and bear it triumphantly, a prisoner in their midst, until it dies of servitude and overwork. That seems familiar. Prince John. The bad guy from Robin Hood was basically the steward of a kingdom his beloved brother hadn't even set foot on, while Richard the Lionheart was faffing about in the Crusades. John was running the kingdom and turning it into something that could sustain itself. While he was doing that, his useless brother gets his ass kidnapped, so John has to raise taxes. Cue Robin Hood. To bring back the rightful king the people love so much. So basically, Prince John runs England for his brother and people love his brother for it. Then said brother gets kidnapped, so John raises taxes to get him back and becomes the bad guy in the eyes of the lords and by extension the people, who want their rightful king back. The man eventually does become the rightful king, only to have all the lords hate him for the crime of investing money into the kingdom. As a result he signs the Magna Carta, limiting royal power. That said, he wasn't a son. The man did have a hand in the collapse of Norman France and wasted a lot of money and men trying to reclaim the region. I'm not trying to say he was a good guy per se, just not the bad guy for what people hate him for. I was just about to say this. He was actually very smart economically. He just got shafted by Richard's BS. Then everyone shitted on him for signing the Magna Carta. But it's not like he had a choice in the matter. It was that or he faced a revolution from the lords. And he cared enough about his country that he didn't want to see that happen. Elizabeth Báthory. Some scholars say that the truth of the claims made against her can't be verified or debunked at this point. But there's good reason to believe that her being painted as a mass murderer was part of a smear campaign and political plot to usurp her land and power, since she was from an extremely powerful family tied to Polish royalty, and the King of Hungary owed a large debt to the Báthory family, which was cancelled in exchange for not putting her on trial. Many historians think that it's possible that Gilles de Rais was framed as well. It depends on the point of view. On Russians' mind, Mikhail Gorbachev is a bad guy because they make him responsible for the end of the Soviet Union. Well, capitalism in Russia hasn't been great either. I mean, quality of life improved, but those transitional years were real hell. These days the country is a mafia state with corrupt police, a false democracy, courts that nobody trusts. All the major natural resources, banks, etc. are owned by billionaire oligarchs and may as well be socialized, and you have no rights. If you protest effectively, you are jailed, poisoned, or fall out of a window somehow. Keeps happening to journalists. Defenestration is a big danger I see. No point here. Just wanted to use the word as I so seldom get to, and it's a cool word. I swear if anyone mentions Hitler, I'd be angrily annoyed. One already has, because he killed Hitler. But he is also the guy who killed the guy who killed Hitler. Louis XVI. Most other kings of France before him were a-holes drunk on power. The dude didn't want to be king. His dream job was being a locksmith. But he was in charge when the people frustration and anger was starting to boil over. So he did a national survey just to know what could be done to make people's life better. But it sent a signal that people mistook for weakness instead of kindness and decided it was a good time to start the French Revolution. That isn't at all what happened. He was a weak king, not really cut out for it, though not a terrible person, but by God he was stubborn and idiotic. Tsar Nicholas looking around anxiously. Jack Kavorkian. He was a doctor who was way ahead of his time. By supporting people's right to choose to end their own suffering, he is often portrayed as a murder-crazy psycho, when in reality he only wanted to give people the right to die with dignity and grace. I'm hoping that as the shift for people's right to die becomes more accepted, history will rewrite the chapter on him. Does Hades count? Cause if so, it's Hades. He's actually a really good guy. He's a loving husband and, to be frank, a very peaceful god. The only time he tormented someone was when two guys tried to steal his wife, Persephone. Sorry if I spelled that wrong. I would go more with good guy Prometheus. Basically, Zeus wanted the humanity to be small, afraid of darkness and perpetually cold. Meanwhile, Prometheus was like, beach, you can't be that low. I'm going to give these people fire. And so Prometheus gave humanity fire, but Zeus was like, oh hell no, and punished Prometheus by letting him be eaten over and over again for eternity simply because he refused to obey the god of thunder. Duck you, Zeus. Edit. I know that Prometheus doesn't have a bad rep. However, if I had to choose between Zeus and Hades, I would pick Hades easily. My whole point was that Zeus is an a-hole. Benedict Arnold. Now, he was a traitor. That's undeniable. But he fought for the colonists earnestly at the beginning of the revolution, but kept having other people taking credit for the battles he was involved in, and was finally accused of being sympathetic to the British because of the social circles he was involved in. This was after he had been wounded twice in battle, and I believe he also lost his civilian business. Basically, he got shit on throughout the revolution by his own side and eventually got sick of it and switched sides. Still a traitor, or a double traitor, since was technically a traitor to the British first, but it didn't happen for no reason. Who? Benedict Arnold. Never heard of him. Ouch. Medusa. Yes, if I could give you an award I would. Let's break this down. First off, whether Medusa was cursed for laying with Poseidon in Athena's temple or raped by him there, she didn't want to become a monster turning people to stone. Second, she lived in a cave and literally didn't seek out people to kill. She minded her business, and it was heroes led by the gods who sought to kill her and take her head for glory. Disgusting. Third, if anyone else were cursed, what would be considered reasonable behavior as a stone-turning gorgon? It's not like she could live a normal life and just go out and about. Living in a cave and not going on a massive killing spree after being cursed like that is pretty impressive to me, and honestly the heroes praised in myths for killing her should be the bad guys. Killing someone who didn't do anything to you is plain wrong. So glad someone brought her up. I actually have a story about her on Wattpad, and I hate the concept of her being the bad guy for no reason. That aside, I don't lose it when artists paint her that way, especially when they write a compelling reason. Like Rick Riordan. He follows the idea that she willingly slept with Poseidon, then later becomes bitter about her curse and lures people in to kill them. Johnny from Cobra Kai. You said that because of the series, right? I just watched it, and there was a part when he tells the story from his perspective. It was awesome. Heinz Doofenshmirtz. From my point of view, the Jedi are evil. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more interviews.